In a town so quiet, it feels like time stands still. A young woman vanishes without a trace. But what if I told you her disappearance wasn't just a random tragedy? What if it was part of a far darker, more twisted plot? And what if the truth was buried so deep, even the people closest to her didn't know what was coming? Detective Sarah Owens had seen her share of disappearances. She'd handled cases where people vanished into thin air, only to be found in the most unexpected places alive or dead. But this one was different. Emma Hayes, just 23 years old, disappeared during a solo hiking trip in the woods that bordered their small town. The authorities initially treated it as a missing person case, but as time wore on, the leads dried up. The town moved on, but Sarah didn't. While everyone else turned away, Sarah found herself drawn back to Emma's case. There was something about it that gnawed at her. The lack of evidence, the strange silence from Emma's family, the absence of any real suspects, it didn't add up. Emma was adventurous, independent. She wouldn't just wander off into the woods and never return. Something wasn't right. But what? For weeks, Sarah reviewed the old case file, hoping to find a crack, a missing piece of the puzzle that could unlock everything. And one night, alone in her office, it hit her. A detail buried in a report from years earlier, a lead so small, it had been dismissed as irrelevant. But to Sarah, it was the thread that could unravel the entire story. The report spoke of a remote cabin just off the hiking trail Emma had last been seen on. And in the case file, there were mentions of similar disappearances, women who had gone missing in the same area, under eerily similar circumstances. All of them were young, all were last seen hiking alone in the same forest. And the most disturbing part? The names had been buried, hidden in forgotten reports left out of the public eye. A pattern no one had ever connected. Emma Hayes wasn't the first. She wasn't even the last. But Sarah was the first to see the pattern, the first to understand the truth that had been carefully covered up. Sarah's investigation led her deep into the woods, places where the trees seemed to close in on you, where the path became more and more difficult to follow. The remote cabin, mentioned in the files, stood in a clearing, weathered and forgotten. It had been abandoned for years, but Sarah knew something was waiting there for her. As she approached the cabin, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. This was no random location. This was a carefully chosen spot, a place where the past had been buried. Sarah stepped inside, careful not to disturb anything. The cabin was a time capsule, old furniture, dusty photographs, a forgotten life frozen in time. But it was what Sarah found in the back room that made her blood run cold. Hidden beneath the floorboards was a box filled with photographs of women, all different women, all young, all smiling, their faces so familiar in their carefree expressions. But the one thing they had in common, they all had connections to the area, and all had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Sarah's heart raced. These weren't just random photos, they were memories. They were a catalog of victims. And the chilling realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Someone had been watching these women for years. Someone had been hiding in plain sight, leaving nothing behind but empty woods and broken families. Back at the station, Sarah continued to piece things together. She began to focus on the people who had been closest to the victims. And as she dug deeper into Emma's family, she found a connection she hadn't expected. Samuel Hayes, Emma's father, was a quiet man, grief. Stricken, yes, but oddly distant. The town knew him as a man who had never given up on his daughter. Despite the police declaring the case cold, Samuel had kept searching, reaching out to anyone who would listen. But the deeper Sarah looked, the more unsettling his behavior became. It was as if he was desperate to control the narrative. He spoke with too much certainty, his details almost rehearsed. He was hiding something, and Sarah wasn't going to let it slide. Over weeks of questioning, Sarah's suspicions about Samuel grew. He wasn't just a father mourning his daughter. He was a man who knew more than he was letting on. Every time Sarah dug deeper, he became more guarded, more defensive. But she knew she had to press on. And one night, as she sat across from Samuel in his dimly lit living room, the truth finally came out. Samuel broke down in front of her, but not in the way Sarah had expected. He didn't cry out of grief. He cried because he knew his secrets were about to be exposed. He told Sarah everything. Emma had been close to uncovering a dark truth. She had been digging into the past her father's past, and she had stumbled upon something that Samuel would do anything to keep hidden. He wasn't just a grieving father. He was a man who had been involved in the disappearance of other young women before Emma. He had orchestrated her disappearance to protect a dark secret that had plagued his family for years. Emma's investigation had gotten too close to the truth, and Samuel couldn't afford to let her expose it. Emma's trip to the woods hadn't been an innocent hike. It had been a trap, set up by someone she trusted, someone who had been planning her disappearance all along. The remote cabin, the hiking trail of everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. And now Sarah understood. Samuel hadn't just lost a daughter. He had sacrificed her to keep his secrets safe. By the time Sarah uncovered the full extent of the truth, it was too late. The damage had been done, and Emma's life had been stolen by the one person who should have protected her most. But the case didn't end with Emma. The other women, the other disappearances, all of it was connected. And as Sarah looked over the files, she realized the pattern went deeper than she could have ever imagined. There were more victims, more names she hadn't uncovered. Samuel's secret wasn't just a family tragedy, it was the tip of the iceberg. The hidden truth had finally surfaced. But at what cost? And how many more secrets lay buried in the shadows, waiting for the next victim? Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. What if I told you that for years, a silent killer has been moving undetected, hidden in plain sight, taking lives in the dead of night, while everyone believed it was just bad luck? And what if I told you that this killer wasn't a person at all, but something much more insidious? Dr. Olivia Carter had seen her fair share of deaths. As a forensic pathologist, she was no stranger to the mysteries of the human body, what caused it to shut down, what made it fail. But this case, it was different. It all started with a series of seemingly natural deaths in a small, sleepy suburban town, a place where crime was rare, and the most scandalous events were bad neighborhood gossip. These deaths, though, didn't make sense. People were dying in their sleep. No signs of trauma, no obvious cause, just sudden, unexplainable deaths. At first, no one thought much of it. A heart attack here, a stroke there, nothing out of the ordinary. But Dr. Carter wasn't convinced. Something about the pattern seemed off. Too many deaths, too many people dying in the same mysterious way. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection, something hidden beneath the surface. And that feeling led her into the darkest corners of forensic medicine, where even the smallest overlooked detail could mean the difference between an accident and a murder. Detective Michael Graves was called in after the death toll climbed. He was a hard-nosed, cynical investigator, someone who didn't believe in coincidences. He'd worked in the department long enough to know that when something didn't add up, you had to dig deeper. But even he was taken aback by the string of deaths that had gone unnoticed by others. The deaths were quietly dismissed as natural causes, but Graves wasn't so quick to accept that. He had worked enough cases to know that sometimes what's labeled as an accident is anything but. Dr. Carter and Detective Graves made an unlikely team. She was driven by the pursuit of answers in her lab, while he scoured the town, digging through the lives of the victims. What they uncovered shocked them both. The pattern they found was chilling. Every single one of the victims had a similar story, seemingly healthy people, all living their lives, and all dying in the same unremarkable way. No struggles, no signs of distress, just sudden death in the middle of the night. But it wasn't just the timing that was odd, it was the symptoms, the unexplained neurological signs that were seen in every case before they died. Dizziness, nausea, confusion, all symptoms that had been dismissed as irrelevant. Nothing that screamed murder. But Dr. Carter's trained eyes saw something others didn't. These were the subtle signs of poisoning. Her investigation led her to a rare and highly toxic substance, one so elusive and undetectable that it had been dismissed by the medical community for decades. This toxin, though nearly impossible to trace in routine tests, was deadly, and it was silent. It could slip into a person's body, cause confusion and illness, and then quietly shut everything down without leaving a mark. A toxin so rare, it could go unnoticed for years, buried in the misdiagnoses of natural causes, a killer that hid behind science. With her suspicions now confirmed, Dr. Carter and Detective Graves worked together to identify the source of this silent killer. They traced the pattern of deaths, finding that the victims had all been part of a small, tight-knit community and neighborhood that had grown complacent with time. People didn't question things anymore. No one ever suspected that someone among them was using this toxin to kill. And then, the unimaginable happened. They traced the poison back to its origin. The source wasn't some unknown, mysterious figure. It was something far more disturbing. A doctor. A trusted local physician who had been living among them, treating the very people he was secretly killing. It was a betrayal that ran deeper than they had ever feared. The killer wasn't a stranger. The killer was someone who had been trusted by the community. Someone who had used his position to quietly administer a death sentence to those he deemed expendable. The physician's motives were cold and calculating. He had become disillusioned, perhaps, or maybe he was simply a predator who knew how to use his position for personal gain. He had been using his knowledge of medical treatments to covertly kill patients with the toxin, knowing that no one would suspect him. And over the years, his practice had become a graveyard. His patients were dying without anyone realizing they had been murdered. As the investigation came to a close, Dr. Carter and Detective Graves finally had the evidence they needed to expose the killer. But by then, the damage had been done. Lives had been stolen, and a community had been forever shattered by the dark secrets hiding in the places they thought were safe. The doctor was arrested, but for the victims' families, the damage could never be undone. They had lost their loved ones to a killer they never saw coming, a killer who had lurked in the shadows, undetected for years. Sometimes, the most dangerous killers aren't the ones you see coming. Sometimes, the true horror lies in the things you never question, the subtle threats hiding in the background, invisible to the naked eye, but deadly all the same. The shadow of the silent killer is the one we never hear coming, until it's too late. What if I told you that a woman has sat in a prison cell for over a decade, convicted of a crime she insists she didn't commit? But what if the truth was buried so deeply beneath layers of silence and fear that even the most experienced detective couldn't see it coming? Detective Jack Lawson had spent his entire career chasing ghost cases where the truth lurked just beyond reach. Yet, no case haunted him more than that of Lydia Green. Convicted of murder, sentenced to life, and silent for over 10 years, she had never defended herself, never pleaded her innocence. She simply accepted her fate. But why? It had all started with the brutal murder of Evelyn Montgomery, a wealthy socialite found stabbed in her mansion. No signs of forced entry, no clear struggle, just a single, precise wound to the chest. The only suspect? Lydia Green, the household maid who had been seen leaving the estate that night. Her fingerprints were on the murder weapon. The husband, Simon Montgomery, was devastated, quick to point the blame. The jury didn't hesitate. Case closed, but not for Lawson. A decade later, whispers began to surface. Rumors of Simon's shady dealings, of a marriage riddled with secrets. Lawson couldn't ignore them. Digging deeper, he revisited the crime scene now abandoned, the walls cracked with time, the silence echoing with unanswered questions. Then, the breakthrough. A forgotten drawer. Hidden letters. Not love notes, but warnings Evelyn had known something dangerous. blackmail, threats, and the name Richard Whitmore, Simon's old business partner, a man who had vanished from town after Evelyn's death. The final piece came from a witness, a former housekeeper, who had been too afraid to speak before. She had seen someone else that night, a man in the shadows, slipping out the back door just before Lydia left. And now, she was ready to talk. Whitmore had been there, and according to the witness, he had been the one to finish the job. But why had Lydia stayed silent? Lawson confronted Simon Montgomery, expecting denial, outrage. Instead, Simon leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You really think you're the first to figure this out?" he mused. "Fine. You want the truth?" I set her up. Whitmore got sloppy, so I let him take the fall. But Lydia knew. Lawson's breath caught. She knew? Simon nodded, his voice dropping to a whisper. She knew I was guilty, and she said nothing because she was protecting me. The room felt colder. Lydia Green had spent 10 years behind bars, not out of guilt, but out of love. She had loved the man who destroyed her life, and in her silence, she had hoped to save him. By the time the truth came to light, Simon was already gone, vanished into the world with his wealth and power. Lydia was freed, but the years lost could never be returned. She stepped out of prison into a world that had moved on without her. The streets looked different. The air smelled unfamiliar. She was free. But free to what? In the end, it wasn't just Lydia's confession that had remained silent. It was a town built on secrets, a case where silence had been the deadliest weapon of all. And as Detective Jack Lawson watched her disappear into the city, he couldn't shake one final question. How many others were still out there, trapped, silenced, protecting the very people who had destroyed them? Some confessions come in words, some never come at all. And those are the ones that haunt you the most.
Like, subscribe, and comment.